Hello, everybody. Thanks so much for joining today. My name is Christopher Wulf. I'll be speaking about the value of showcasing here at Dev.Play 2020. Hopefully, we'll meet in person next year, but otherwise, stick around until the end for a Q&A session. Let me just quickly start this off. All right, I believe you should all be now able to see my orange screen. Let's get this started. As a quick heads up, this talk is going to be very much PC console focused and with premium games in mind. Mobile and free to play, VR, all might have some applicable information here, but my background comes from sort of the PC console era. So I'd just like to make that clear from the get-go. Speaking about my background, as mentioned, my name is Christopher Wulf. I formerly used to work in events, most notably for a thing called the Indie Mega Booth, which is a indie showcase organizer / curator, mostly focused on North America, but also active in Asia and Europe to some degree. I was in charge of curation and developer relations, meaning I was their main point of contact, and I got luckily to see hundreds of developers go through. Some end up being successful with their launches, some unfortunately not so much. In my free time, I judge and help curate a bunch of indie game showcases and awards at roughly like a dozen events a year. A couple of event participations you can see in like the bottom right corner here, but overall, yeah, these are just varying degrees of like events where I've played a minor to bigger role within. These days, I'm the publishing director for Romanian or Bucharest-based company, Those Awesome Guys. We are a developer publishing hybrid, made, move, or die, published Monster Prom, and published Floppy Nights, or publishing Floppy Nights. And one of the many things I deal with is events. Speaking of which, as a publisher, obviously, we have like our own little experience doing events and participating in events, anything from showcasing to just being there for business development, attending, even prior to working in the games industry, or volunteering. We've seen it all. A couple of highlights, as you can see, like here in the PlayStation booth, that was GDC of 2019, back when physical events were still a thing. And here we were in the Romanian RGDA booth at Gamescom 2019. One more thing you should know about us, since I'll be talking about both of these titles a little bit today. At top is Monster Prom, published game by us, a multiplayer dating sim / visual novel. Bottom, Move or Die, made by us, a party game. We call it like the friendship ruining party game, action platformer. All you need to know really, just keep in mind, both party games, both multiplayer. Now, the big question of today that I'll be trying to solve for you here, or at least have some tips for you on, is showcasing the best option? Obviously, I'm a little bit conflicted, or I guess used to be conflicted due to my background in events. These days, we also, as a publisher, have to figure out for ourselves what we invest our marketing budget into. So I'm a little bit more, not critical, but just careful when it comes to selecting which events we participate in. Part of the reason why I talk about this so often is what I call like the 2020 indie budgets, probably more like 2019 now that COVID has affected everything. This year, we'll be looking at roughly 1,000 pitches altogether as a company, and a surprising amount, at least surprising to me at first, of projects are more and more relying or dedicating their entire marketing costs and marketing budgets towards showcasing, which is something that can definitely be included overall, but I'm always a little bit skeptical and honestly a little bit afraid when I see it being the only avenue being focused on overall. If it wasn't clear enough, COVID, I think, in 2020 changed things a lot, or everything basically. We're seeing some changes being made, but lots of people are still looking at 2021 as if PAX and GDC and Gamescom and all those events will be back to how they were previously, which I'm a little bit skeptical of right now. Move or Die, to sort of close the circle here, as I mentioned, local multiplayer and online multiplayer party game. It's basically the perfect game for a in-person event. Game was at many showcases over the years, Gamescoms, PAXs, and due to its excitement and the loudness factor, high energy, it draws in a lot of people. Plus, with 4 stations or 4 controllers, you can very quickly rotate through, so people won't have to wait so long to play the game. Over a PAX period, I couldn't tell you how many people get a chance to actually sit down and play a single player experience. It highly depends. But with a multiplayer experience, those chances are highly increased overall. In the early days of events, it may have been quite effective having games on a display and actually being able to play them, which then at the end of the day may have converted to sales. These days, things are getting a little bit more tricky. Speaking of sales, there's this whole big misconception about going to events, managing to tap into that audience of a couple 100,000 people attending, and then that immediately directly leading into sales. This is an older sales spike or sales graph from when Move or Die was still being shown at regular events. Anything from like South by Southwest to E3 or Gamescom, you can see at the bottom here, there's pretty much no correlation, at least directly, between an event happening and sales going up. Typically, that doesn't happen. We've talked to many developers and publishers over the years, and it's quite similar in that sense. You could argue that people see a lot of games, go home, then wishlist some of them, and then maybe buy them when they get the notification on Steam from the next sale. And that's probably also the case for a lot. But the direct correlation of really selling your game at full price after having demonstrated it to someone at an event is really not there. And it's tricky to point towards it as sort of a argument for why you should be spending so much money for international travel and going to these major conferences. Exposure is the second factor here that I'd like to talk a little bit about. Obviously, things have changed a lot in independent games development over the years. 2012, sort of the era post or just around Indie Game the Movie, I believe, you had the Indie Mega Booth at PAX East with about 21 games. Fast forward 7 years, and that number has almost become, well, it has not only doubled, but well, expanded heavily, let's put it that way, from 21 to 77. In the same way that the Indie Arena booth has gone from 10 developers to 108 just last year, which is phenomenal. And I love both of these organizations. But you have to keep in mind that you're now competing with other independent developers for an audience. The counter argument that I also like to just highlight here is typically that audience has grown extensively over the years, whereas the indie sections at some of the conferences were quite small in the beginning. These days, they are some of the main attractions. I know many people that go to Gamescom exclusively because they want to see the Indie Arena booth. So you will have people spend literally all 5 or 4 days of Gamescom on the show floor checking out independent talent. There's pros and cons to everything here, but exposure can go both ways. Speaking of opportunities overall, when it comes to exposure, there's a lot of events happening these days. A great tracking website called gameconfguide.com, which I can really recommend. It tracks both digital and physical events. And if physical events return in 2021, these spikes are probably going to be way higher overall. You will want to focus on less events overall that provide value to you. That's sort of the main takeaway I have from here. There's many events out there and many of great opportunities to actually showcase your project. But at the end of the day, a day has 24 hours, a year has 365, 66 days, depending, well, every 4 years you get that additional day. But still, you end up having limited time, and spending all your time just traveling to events while you are making a game or have made a game and should be probably considering about what's next is not necessarily the most effective when it comes to time. Same goes for money. So free showcases are a fantastic and super valuable opportunity in many ways, but free doesn't mean free. At the end of the day, when you're not paying a submission fee, you're still spending lots and lots of hours preparing for an actual showcase. That can be staff hours during an event, the preparation that goes into an event, no matter if it's design, preparing a build for the booth. Travel can be a big factor, and accommodation in a non-COVID year, you will have to dedicate some time for some sort of recovery afterwards because events are exhausting. And then again, non-COVID years, you have business cards, you have prints, you have handouts, things you give away at conferences. All of that costs money. And even if you didn't pay money for the booth itself, it's not free. The conclusion overall that I want to point towards is talk to experienced devs, talk to people that have actually been at these events and have seen what they could take away from the overall experience. Now, let's talk a little bit about what's happened this year in 2020. If you want to point towards one thing that's maybe a positive consequence for COVID, it's these digital festivals, one of which you're currently participating in as in Dev.Play. The most common one on the consumer side is probably the Steam Games Festival. We just saw them wrap up a tabletop or digital tabletop festival, I think a week or 2 ago at this point. And we'll be seeing a couple more of these Steam Games Festivals. There was one this summer, which you can see on screen. There was one this fall, and there's at least 2 more coming, one in spring and summer of next year. The great thing here is it opens up the door for global audience while also making sure, while also allowing people without the necessary visa requirements or just financial backing to be able to travel to all these conferences to participate on a major opportunity here with Steam, one of the biggest platforms for games in the world. At the same time, one thing you have to keep in mind with these festivals is they're mostly focused on pre-release titles. So as long as you're still developing your title, that's great. You can really focus your time and energy on these, and at the end of the day, will hopefully generate some wish lists and visibility out of it. But if you have a release title out there, this is not the avenue that you're looking for, that you're going for. Keep in mind, it's highly competitive. Typically, for like a PAX show floor, you're maybe competing with a couple hundred titles. A Steam Games Festival, I believe the first of them had about 1,000 demos that people were able to try out. So visibility is another factor here to keep in mind. Again, I don't want to contradict myself too much, but I want to make sure everyone sees both sides here. Visibility is, of course, somewhat limited due to the amounts of titles that you have there. At the same time, a PAX has maybe a couple 100,000 attendees, while Steam has about, I think last I reported was 95 million monthly active users. Very different scale that you're looking at here. So at the end of the day, please make sure to consider what's best for you while we're still in lockdown or doing like within the middle of a COVID year. Digital festivals can be a big factor for you both during development, but also after development. If any of you have been paying attention, this should be live at this point or during Dev.Play. It's the Eastern European Games Steam event that was put together by the lovely Dev.Play crew. It's definitely less competitive overall. There's no rules necessarily put together in place by Steam on how you can participate and especially how many you can participate in. For Steam Games Festival, the ones that they're running right now, there is a new limitation that out of the 3 ones announced currently, the fall one that just happened, spring and summer, you were only allowed to participate in 1, whereas these independently organized like non-official Steam events, you can participate in many, which luckily we as a developer and publisher have been able to do. Rules are typically made by the organizers themselves, so there is a chance they allow for unreleased titles, as it was the case in this one. But usually it's also tougher to get into because they're curated by various independent groups and not necessarily promoted on Steam until they are online. One thing, just a general tip, if you hear someone talking about Steam events being part of like a package that you can get out of participating in events, those are not all the time promoted in a big way. We're lucky that the Eastern European Games Festival or Eastern European Games Steam event is being promoted on Steam itself and getting a lot of visibility that way. But other events will get an event page set up that's only available via the direct hyperlink that they can share through their own communities, which means you're really missing out on those millions and millions of regular Steam users that don't know about the event happening at the time. Another and final format that I just want to take a look at briefly is sort of the proprietary event pages. This one is from PAX Online a couple of weeks ago. Indie Arena booth had their own take on creating a digital environment where you could actually interact with developers and participants. There's varying success typically. It's hard to get attendees really used to them, but especially for these Discord communities or in the case of the Indie Arena booth, I remember there were many thousand attendees over the span of sort of the digital Gamescom week. So it is an alternative that might be growing that you can keep in mind. Pricing is still something to be figured out in this day and age. I remember PAX unfortunately got some backlash for some quite highly priced digital booth spaces that people weren't too happy with. So we'll have to see how things develop over the next coming months. When should you showcase? Now, I put together a little case study here based on one of the projects that we have published called Monster Problem. My main message here is you should never go towards an event with the expectation of an immediate return on investment, especially on the financial side. You may take a lot away from the event, but if you're considering making back the same amount of money in the same period of the event that you're investing into it, then you will have probably a quite rough time, at least for the first couple of iterations. Some developers have really found out good strategies of doing so, such as selling pins and other merchandise or the game keys themselves at events, but that's still something you have to get the consumer used to over time. Now, for Monster Prom's case study, as mentioned, we're looking at pre-launch 2017. Back then, the development team went to GDC, a very good avenue for developer feedback, biz dev conversations, just to kick those off, or overall to talk to publishers, as well as PAX West, which is a consumer show in the US. Great, again, for business development. Actually, we as a publisher got to know the project back then closer and ended up working with them after the event, as well as community building, because that event was happening during their Kickstarter campaign. The game overall is super community driven. Just made sense to visit the community that you're targeting with your title at PAX, a super diverse and open-minded community overall when it comes to game conventions, which Monster Prom, if you didn't know, it's a very LGBTQ plus friendly title. So it was just like a perfect match there. 2018, the year of the release. So launch and post-launch marketing were super important. Game ended up going to PAX East and PAX West as well. Again, consumer shows that really had their core audience in mind and was very representative of that core audience. So press appointments had made were a big deal there. Jesse Cox, who is a influencer slash YouTuber and also an executive producer on Monster Prom, was on site and actually could interact with press or with fans that were swinging by. Again, a great way of activating the community, as well as, of course, the typical launch celebration or post-launch celebration with fans that you will have. And then looking at 2019, again, sort of the usual PAXs that we're looking at for the DLC, which released just around PAX East in spring, and then in the fall during the Kickstarter for the sequel that was running, the team visited PAX again. I made a little breakdown here that you can, of course, screenshot or just scroll back to afterwards. Very nice. It's very important at the end of the day to really consider what you're going for with your event participation. If you just want to participate for the sake of it, might not really be worth spending those thousands and thousands of dollars on an event itself. If you have a clear goal, then, or if you know what you want to achieve to transition over here, then you will have a way better outcome and at least will be able to measure your success rather than going at it without any goals in mind. Where should I showcase is another big topic that people tend to, maybe not think about enough. Typically, this is a very generalized and clearly outdated slide. Typically, this is maybe somewhat of how the breakdown worked. Press, go to E3, business, Gamescom, and developers ended up at GDC to connecting with each other. That has really changed over the years. Worldwide, there's dozens and dozens and, hundreds of events at this point, both on an in-person level as well as online, and it's really tricky to figure out what you're going for. If you're a student, you might want to take advantage of the free pass at Dev.Play. Community for indies, then there's really nothing that compares to PAX, and a mobile developer will be looking out for Pocket Gamer Connects as an example. If you're local, again, Dev.Play in a regular year here in Bucharest would be the right fit for you. There's a sheer amount of events. This was, as an example, just a couple of weeks ago, October 22nd, with a sheer incredible amount of events happening simultaneously, obviously all online. And that will probably get even bigger, worse or better, depending on how you interpret it in 2021, no matter if we're back to in-person events or things keep digital. Make sure to account for that time of investing or investigating what's the right fit for you. To have things a little bit more practical, again, for Monster Prom, we talked about it very briefly. PAX was the perfect community for the game. It was a PC title back then, now also on console, very diverse and open-minded audience, English only, and about 2 years ago, where the international biz dev or just general international business angle at Gamescom wasn't quite where it is these days. GDC for business, therefore, was sort of on the table, quite easy. PAX for mostly consumers, and relationships to other industry veterans also worked out very well. As a matter of fact, as I mentioned, we as a publisher actually connected with Beautiful Glitch at PAX. Now, If things had been different, and if we had been looking at other localizations, such as Chinese or Japanese, where there's quite an interest from the local audience and already was back when they were running their initial Kickstarter, then we would have looked at these events potentially. Tokyo Game Show in Japan, Bit Summit in Japan, and We Play in China. But then again, it's problematic because with LGBTQ plus friendly content as a monster problem, We Play wouldn't have been possible in China. Finally, post-launch, to wrap things up here as a more practical example, platform-related events, once and if they return, such as PlayStation Experience, X020, the Xbox event, Xbox Game Festivals, that are all really great opportunities if you're looking to target an audience that's just interested in your console release. Expansions or localization can be a good opportunity to refocus on particular markets. Again, Japanese release, Bit Summit or Tokyo Game Show, and postmortem talks, business development opportunities based on your already released title, well, then you might end up at GDC. A big factor that people tend to forget or just overlook is the surrounding area. In Seattle, you have PAX West, but there's much more than that, which is why I regularly like to attend when possible. You have Valve or Steam, Xbox and Nintendo just within driving distance of like half an hour, maybe 40 minutes. Well, with traffic, it could be 3 hours, but that set aside. But you also have Twitch, Epic, Amazon, Oculus, Google, all of them in town. You have potential events hosted by ID Xbox in their own office spaces. You have meetings that you can attend to, workshops, again, by platform owners, for example. It's really hard to put a monetarily value on that, on these personal interactions. But it's a good solution if you're just looking at making those connections. Rather than potentially considering actually attending an event, you would end up going to the event, for showcasing the event, you would rather just go and attend as a business developer or to, just meet other people in the industry and learn from that. What are my options? Just to put things a little bit into perspective. There's plenty of opportunities out there at every bigger show usually. This graph is slightly outdated overall, but one thing that it should highlight here is how many different opportunities within a single event you might have. If you go into, let's say, GDC, for example, GDC will not only have its own expo floor, but there will be a mix in town, a media indie exchange, and more of a press and influence event. You also have an indie mega booth there, as well as varying country pavilions. The same goes for Gamescom, a consumer show, where we were lucky enough, and this is this example, to have a booth hosted by the RGDA a couple of years ago, I believe in 2018 must have been, which is absolutely stunning. And that's something that you really only get to take advantage of if you are in the know, if you stay in touch with other developers out there, or if you're part of your local government or government-driven organizations, for example. Standalone events obviously have a big impact as well, as you can see here, and those are probably just going to be increasing in the future. Now, to summarize things and wrap things up, for us, this whole process of figuring out if I want to attend and what I want to attend is figuring out three things or three goals. One, games as community. For us, it's important to keep games going. We want to launch a title in our practical example here and make sure that it continues to develop over time, not only on the developer side, but also increase its audience. That means we'll probably be focusing on consumer shows such as Gamescom and PAX and Poznan Games Arena to build a community on site, come back every year, every other year, remind them that we're still there and have that personal close touch or close communication with our fans and our community. Second one is expand globally. As a publisher ourselves, we want to, of course, tap into new markets. That means Southeast Asia is super attractive, South America as well. We'll want to make it and actually attend and visit those markets, meaning Brazil Indie Games Festival, We Play, Tokyo Game Show will definitely be goals at the end of the day. And then finally, build our brand. We have some plans with those awesome guys in the long run of how to increase the brand, how to build it, and make it maybe a little bit bigger over time. So small and mid-sized events can still be quite attractive to us, where we can show off our brand, scout new games, or even combine it with like a speaking opportunity overall. Online here, again, is a great opportunity to combine all of that together and keep things a little bit more affordable overall. So at the end of the day, many doors are open or many doors are worthwhile just peeking into and exploring. two quick tips here. Event organizers should be your best friends. Not only because I used to be an event organizer and we like to stay close with independent developers, but at the end of the day, they have the final control, not the actual attendees. They know about opportunities before anyone else does. They might be able to help you out if you're in a tricky situation at an event or prior to the event, and staying close to them will make sure that you probably hear about things first. Staff is last to see the money. That is unfortunately the reality of events. So please make sure to stay friendly, stay kind. They likely have 20 plus hour days at the end of the day, and they are working their asses off to make an event happen of any size. All right, and opportunities, as I'd mentioned and pointed out before, all the platforms typically know or are preparing things for bigger events. If you're going to GDC, there might be an Xbox mixer, there might be a Valve meeting, there will be a Women in Games brunch or a Unity showcase. Unless you're that 1%, within that 1% audience of games that everyone is currently fighting for, it's hard to learn about these opportunities. It doesn't hurt if you ask, if you just stay regularly updated, stay close to your developer friends, talk to each other. Word of mouth is the ultimate best way of sharing information. And with that, thanks so much for listening. You can reach me either via email or on Twitter. And if you have any more questions, there will be a Q&A right afterwards.
All right. So we're now live with Chris. Hey, Chris, good to see you. So thanks for the presentation. So we're having a great time here on the technical side because the presentations, the questions on the chat just disappeared. We're gonna figure that out. But I do have a couple of questions from Discord. So here's one. When do you think is a good time for developers to showcase versus not to showcase? So if they have an event coming up, what are good reasons not to showcase? Because I would think that it's always good to showcase.
Good question. I mean, generally, I agree. There's always a chance or a good reason to showcase. For me, this is perfect. Now my phone is ringing. Should be good. There's always a good reason to showcase. A big factor here is pricing. If you have the time available, if you have the resources available, and think right now there is an opportunity to make use of that due to wanting to get some wish lists added up to your Steam page, or generally just looking out for a B2B opportunity, might be a good chance there. Unless you see an ultimate goal that you're working towards, I think you may as well also choose to skip an event.
Okay. So do numbers match up when looking at the number of wish lists or buys after an event? Do they ever rise following an event?
Well, ultimately they hopefully should. Buys, as I had like a little graph in my presentation, don't necessarily match up most of the times. You only saw the move or die graph there that I was showcasing, but we've put a lot of resources into actually looking into this from multiple angles with different developers, anything from like a small independent title to even the bigger ones. And those typically show the same pattern. They don't really match up. On the wishlist side, sometimes there's a bump. Again, it's really heavily dependent on your call to action. If you really, really put an emphasis on making sure people go home, they remember your game, ideally you have newsletter signups directly at your booth if it's in person, then there may be a chance later on to see a bump in wish lists. Otherwise, similar graphs than you typically do when purchasing games.
All right. And last question. What are best practices of creating a call to action for people visiting the booth when showcasing? I don't know, is it a promo code that is only valid during the show? What do you recommend in this regard?
For at least from my point of view, newsletters are fantastic. A way of ensuring that someone who sits down at your booth will sign up because they are already there. you already have a way of contacting them directly, and afterwards you can still send them a Steam page to wishlist, for example. Otherwise, if you just tell someone, hey, once you're home or on your phone, follow us on Twitter, whatsoever, there's a very high chance that due to the noise at an event, actual noise or just noise of exposure, they will miss out on whatever call to action you have. So getting down their email, having maybe a little pop-up in your build that already offers them to sign up here to get notified when the game comes out is a really good opportunity of keeping people on the hook.
Okay, and we're a little bit late, but let's just take one last one. So at big physical events, should projects focus on press/business or the general audience if they have to choose between the two?
Very much depends. I mean, press is a factor that can be a big point at the end of the day. Maybe give you some exposure. Typically, if you have a chance to choose between audience or consumers at the end of the day and press, I go for the audience. I go for the player. Business or consumers is a totally different question. It very much depends on if you're looking for a opportunity to partner up with someone or if you're looking to actually sell to the final customer. So there's not really a clear answer there.
Okay. So people, I guess, can find you on Discord if they have additional questions throughout the day. Thank you very much, Chris, for the presentation and for the answers. I'll see you around.